So we have in America the myth of the middle class, which just simply means that most of us imagine ourselves as a member of the middle class. Okay, most of us imagine class to look like it does here in this visual on the left. Okay, the middle class is the bulk of us, and we have a small upper class and lower class. But in reality, most Americans lack class consciousness, and the real class breakdown looks much more like the visual on the right, the 6-part model, where you can see that the working class, is the largest class in our society. Most Americans tend to see themselves in more simplistic terms. They see this 4-part model here, okay? That the upper class, it's like the elite who own the means of production, dominate the economic system. Lower upper class, they've just become upper class but don't have the established pedigree. Middle class, they stuff upper middle class in there, they stuff lower middle class in there and just make it all one class. So these are professionals with high-paying jobs and respected occupations, and skilled workers who work in moderately compensated occupations, own a few assets. Then they just dump everybody else in the lower class. Okay, so working class, those living at the lowest level of subsistence, homeless, the whole 9 yards. We just shove everybody in there. So we have this very simplistic idea of class, which also kind of explains why we put ourselves in the middle class category. So if we're studying class, how do we measure it? Well, you can try to use self-report, but you've got that whole problem of the myth of the middle class, that everybody sees themselves as middle class. You can use objective measures, income, education, occupation. We combine those 3 things, income, education, occupation, to mean socioeconomic status. These are simple measures. They tend to be reliable. Some people add wealth as well. You can also use observational measures. We can look at your social networks, because we know that people tend to be friends with people who are like them in terms of education, income, race, etc., etc. We can look at your material possessions, your opportunity structures, but that's very expensive and very hard to standardize. So typically, if we're going to try to measure it, we're going to look at objective measures. What difference does class make? It makes all the difference in the world. Everything you see here and more. The higher my class, the better physical health I'm going to have. It's going to impact how I parent, how many children I have. It's often impacts the political party and religious beliefs I espouse, my experiences with the criminal justice system. It impacts everything. Class is everywhere. Although race is not an actual component of class, there is a clear intersection. And research shows us that non-whites generally have less wealth and education than other social groups, and are more likely to experience discrimination when buying homes. Obviously, there's exceptions. We're talking generalizations here. But when we try to ignore the role of race and class, we're just focusing on an individual's accomplishments or failures, and we miss ongoing group level inequality. There are 2 ways of defining poverty. One is absolute poverty, those with so little income that survival is difficult, and relative poverty. That means you have significantly less income than other people in your community or society. The United States, understands itself as a middle-class society. And this fits with strongly held ideology, including the idea that we're a classless society. We're not. The idea of meritocracy, which simply means that I get what I work for, and the idea of work ethic. Middle-class ideologies tend to promote reproduction of inequality. If we were in person with one another and I asked you, how many of you think you're middle class? Most of you would raise your hand. Most Americans think they're middle class. And this is because we know a lot of people who have more than us and plenty of people who have less than us. We don't think about the mathematics of class systems. We focus on lifestyles, income, similar factors, okay? But since the 1970s, there has been a changing gap between the rich and poor that's increased, and it has greatly reduced the size of the middle class. Interestingly, those in the middle classes are very likely in good economic times to identify with ideologies that reproduce systems of stratification. And that's largely because if you think you're middle class and you think, well, I've made it here through my hard work, then other people can do the same thing that I've done. We can see here from this visual, the middle class is shrinking over time. If we look here from 1971 to 2015, there's been a significant shrinkage in the size of the middle class. We look at income by households. We can see that middle class accounts for 43.7% of the income. And you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but in the other thing, the working class was the largest. Right, because these categories of class are not hard and fast, and not all experts agree on what constitutes what class. So that makes studying class all the more complicated. Okay, let's take a look at this. U.S. distribution of wealth, perception versus reality. So the top column here is what Americans think the distribution is. So they think the top 20% have that red section there, and the bottom have that section there. Okay. Orange, the next 20%, middle 20%, next to the bottom 20%. That's what they think it is. And they say that ideally you see a much more equal distribution, right? But the actual distribution of wealth is even worse than most people think that it is. Okay. Okay, I realize these are numbers for 1999, so just assume things have gotten worse. You can see that while the richest 20% of all families, it's not the 1%, it's the top 20%, account for nearly 50% of the income, they own 84% of all the wealth, which is a disproportionate breakdown. And we look at wealth, that is even more concentrated than income. We look at distribution of before tax income 2013 and distribution of wealth. You can see a similar sort of pattern. This is even worse, though, than the 1999 data because this is not top 20%, it's top 3%. So top 3% get 31% of the before tax income. So they're making that much more money, and they own more than more than half of that made no sense. More than half of the wealth. Okay, and then you look at the next 7%. See, and they've got a small piece of the pie. It's a little bit more representative. And then the bottom 90%, they're making more than half of all the income, but they only have a quarter of all of the wealth. So you can see that it's a very unequal distribution. That's the point of that. And then we can look here at the rise and fall of middle class wealth. This is the share of total U.S. wealth owned by the bottom 90% of families. So everybody but the top 10% from 1917 to 2012. And you can see that started kind of here in the middle, and it dipped down and dipped up, and now it's falling again.